Today we're looking at singers who left us way too soon. Where would we be without these voices? And what if they were still around? Let's get into it.
Ooh, let's go.
Number 10, Buddy Holly. Okay, Buddy Holly is known for being kind of the voice of the emerging rock and roll scene of the 1950s. He had this really kind of poppy, bubblegum, soft and sweet kind of vocal style.
Every day it's getting closer, going faster than a roller coaster.
Which matched beautifully with his production, which was always really clean and neat and friendly. In the early Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney were absolutely obsessed with Buddy Holly. And his vocal style actually influenced lots of early Beatles hits like Love Me Do. Unfortunately, on February 3rd, 1959, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, the Big Bopper, and some other famous artists at the time died in a plane crash. Buddy Holly was only 22 years old and was at the absolute peak of his fame. Funny little story is that Don McLean's American Pie actually references the death of Buddy Holly as the day the music died. Number 9, Selena. So Selena was without a doubt the premier figure in women Tejano music. But more than just kind of a one-trick pony, she was actually finishing work on her album Dreaming of You, which would become her first big crossover pop hit. And that fused lots of different genres like Tejano music with contemporary pop music. Unfortunately, in March of 1995, her fan club president, Yolanda Saldivar, shot and killed Selena. This was in Corpus Christi, Texas, one of the bedrocks of Tejano music. Unfortunately, Selena, the Mexican-American pop star, was only 23 years old at the time. And to add insult to injury, 3 months after her death, her album Dreaming of You debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Top 200, which was the first for any Latin American artist in history. Number 8, Ian Curtis. So Ian Curtis, personal icon of mine, was the singer of Joy Division, one of the biggest stars of the pop punk scene. Known for really kind of fusing a lot of the old school punk and new wave elements, Ian Curtis really, his vocal style changed a lot over time from being kind of like a straightforward kind of punk thrash sound towards being kind of a deeper baritone, kind of more robotic sound, which influenced countless bands coming after it. But unfortunately, Ian Curtis had a really troubled life. He suffered from severe depression and epilepsy. To make things even worse, he would sometimes have seizures on stage and around the band's tours, just as they were becoming successful. On May 18th of 1980, at just 23 years old, Ian Curtis hung himself in his home listening to an Iggy Pop album. The surviving bandmates decided to continue moving on, and they created a band called New Order, which was one of the most classic genre-defining sounds of the 80s. Number 7, Patsy Cline. Man, it doesn't get much better than Patsy Cline's voice. She really kind of found a way to fuse together old country-style ballads with her velvety, smooth, soft as silk voice.
Easy for thinking that my love could hold you.
Unfortunately, Patsy passed away in an airplane crash outside of Camden, Tennessee on March 5th, 1963. And what was really unfortunate was she had kind of a slow rise to success, and she was just starting to see the fruits of her labor and her fame, and she actually became more famous after she passed away. I'm sorry to say that that is the case for many of these artists. She was 30 years old. Number 6, Elliott Smith. Now, if you've been following my channel for a while, you probably know that I absolutely worship Elliott Smith. He was one of the biggest reasons that I got into singing and songwriting in the first place. And one of the first things that you'll probably hear about Elliott Smith was just how incredibly beautiful his songs were, but also the tragedy of his death. So let's get into it. Elliott Smith was originally in a band called Heat Miser, kind of in the post-punk scene, and then he later went on to create some of the most beautiful singer-songwriter acoustic ballads that you've ever heard.
People, you've been before that you don't.
This eventually led to him becoming Oscar nominated for the song Miss Misery, which was placed in the Good Will Hunting soundtrack. Unfortunately, Smith very publicly suffered from big bouts of depression, alcoholism, and other substance abuse. On October 21st, 2003, he was found with a self-inflicted knife wound to his chest by his girlfriend. Now, the big tragedy to me, outside of the obvious with Elliott Smith's death, was that he was actually getting clean. But he had been fighting these demons for a very, very long time and very publicly, and you can hear it all over his music. Number 5, Jimi Hendrix. What can you actually say about Jimi Hendrix that hasn't been said before? Jimi Hendrix was arguably the greatest instrumentalist in the history of rock and roll music. He absolutely pushed the boundaries of what was possible on guitar, being some of the very first records to actually showcase tons of vibrato, tremolo, dive bombs, distortion, delay. This made him one of the most influential guitarists and musicians of the 60s. But it's kind of crazy to think that Jimi Hendrix's career only spanned about 4 years. In a year after playing that anthemic Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock, he was dead. On September 18th, 1970, Hendrix was found dead. He basically aspirated or choked to death while he was intoxicated with barbiturates, which are like tranquilizers, like sleeping pills. He was just 27 years old. Number 4, Sam Cooke. It's hard to imagine soul and R&B music and vocals just in general without Sam Cooke. But that wasn't all. Sam Cooke actually became a huge voice during the civil rights movement as well. He was born in Mississippi, raised in Chicago, and was really responsible for bringing soul to kind of a more pop-oriented consciousness. Nicknamed Mr. Wonderful, his voice was smooth as silk and just so full of emotion.
I was born by the river.
And on December 11th, 1964, he was shot allegedly in self-defense by a hotel manager. Despite the crazy details around his death, and you can listen to a full episode about his death, it's just absolutely crazy. 11 days after, his greatest song, A Change Is Gonna Come, was released. The song became a civil rights landmark and became one of the trademark hits of the 60s. At the time of his death, Cooke was only 33 years old. Number 3, Janis Joplin. Kind of like Hendrix, there's really not a whole lot that you can say about Joplin that it hasn't been said before. She had one of the bluesiest, soulful, raspiest, most emotional voices of the 1960s.
You know you got it if it makes you feel good. Come on, man.
She became a huge star with her first band, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and then later went solo. Unfortunately, Joplin also struggled with substance abuse, and she succumbed to a fatal heroin overdose on October 4th, 1970. This was just 2 weeks after the death of Jimi Hendrix, and she was just 27. And again, to add insult to injury, Joplin hadn't really experienced her mainstream success that she would get from her solo career. They released the album Pearl, featuring her biggest hit, Me and Bobby McGee, after her death. Number 2, Amy Winehouse. I don't think you could argue that there was a better R&B or soul vocalist of the early 2000s than Amy Winehouse. Her signature alto, brassy, kind of like honking saxophone vocal sound just absolutely influenced everyone that came after her, including Adele.
They try to make me go to rehab. I say no, no, no.
Unfortunately, the singer very publicly battled with demons of substance abuse and alcohol abuse. She was found dead in her home July 23rd of 2011. Another singer and member of the 27 Club, she was found dead due to an accidental alcohol overdose. Before we get to the number 1 spot, you should know that there are just tons of singers that we did not have the time to cover. Some of the singers that didn't make this list were either a bit older than some of the ones that are on the list, or maybe were past the peak of their fame. But that doesn't make their deaths any less tragic. I wanted to keep this list of vocalists to the ones that passed away just before or at the peak of their fame. Singers like Freddie Mercury, Whitney Houston, Marvin Gaye, John Lennon, Prince, Bob Marley, Michael Jackson, Chester Bennington, Chris Cornell, Mark Bolan of T-Rex, Aaliyah, Karen Carpenter, Tupac, and Biggie. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to cover all of them. But if you're interested in seeing another video, let me know in the comments. All of these singers and musicians were incredible artists in their own right. And part of being an amazing artist is the ability to evolve and adapt to changing times. So while some of these artists sound very, very, very much like a specific time and place in music, it's unlikely that they would have just stayed there. I'm positive that they would have contributed enormously to the culture of music as time went on. So in a way, it's joyful, but also sad to think about what could have been. Okay, at number 1, we have Kurt Cobain. This is probably the death that broke the 90s. Cobain was known for his incredibly emotional screaming on pitch, his raspy vocal tone, his intentional vocal breaks, and just being able to write songs that just made you feel so darkly and deeply depressed, but at the same time sounded so good. Now, unfortunately, it's been said before that there are some people that just don't and should not be famous. And Cobain talked publicly about how much he loathed being a famous person. He also struggled a lot with heroin addiction and had a publicly tumultuous relationship with his wife, Courtney Love. Dave Grohl said, "Unfortunately, Nirvana became too big, too quick. Bands are like families that go through uncomfortable growing pains. And if it happens all at once, it's just too much to handle." But Cobain started doing the right things. He checked himself into rehab, but unfortunately, it wasn't enough. Just days after checking out of a drug rehab center in LA, Cobain was found dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, which was ruled a suicide. He died on Tuesday, April 5th, 1994, at just 27 years old. One of the things that makes Cobain's death especially tragic to me is imagining what could have been. If you or someone that you know is struggling emotionally or has a mental illness and needs help, there are resources available to you. I've left them in the description below.